He arrived at the convent gate on a November night in 1948, with no coat, no identification, and a wound in his left shoulder that had been bleeding for long enough that the shirt beneath his jacket had gone completely stiff with dried blood. I was the one who answered the gate because I was always the one who answered the gate at that hour, not because it was assigned to me, but because I was the lightest sleeper in the convent of St. Jadwiga in the mountain town of Nowy Targ, and I had learned across 17 years of convent life that the people who came to gates in the middle of the night were the people who most needed someone to answer. He was 26 years old, and he had been running for 3 days through the Tatra Mountains in November, and he was alive by a margin so narrow that I could measure it in the color of his face when I held the lantern up and looked at him. He said one sentence in Polish before his legs gave out, and I caught him by the arm and took his weight and pulled him through the gate. The sentence was this: "I am not a criminal. I am a patriot, and they are not the same thing, and I need you to understand that before you decide what to do with me." I told him that I would decide what to do with him after I had dealt with the shoulder, and that he should save his explanations for when he had enough blood in his body to make them coherent. He almost smiled at that. I brought him inside and I closed the gate, and I began the process of making a decision that would shape the following 4 years of my life and his, and through his, eventually, the lives of considerably more people than either of us could have calculated on that November night in 1948. My name is Sister Anastasia Krupinska, and I was 41 years old when Tomasz Wilecki came through the gate of St. Jadwiga, and I want to tell you who I was before I tell you who he was, because who I was determined everything about the choices I made across the 4 years that followed, and those choices deserve to be understood in their full context. I had grown up in Nowy Targ, the daughter of a family that had been in the Podhale region of southern Poland for as many generations as anyone could trace, which meant I was mountain people, and mountain people in southern Poland have a specific relationship to authority that is not quite like the relationship that flatland people have. The mountains provide a geography of refuge that flatland does not offer, and a geography of refuge produces over generations a culture that understands the difference between the law as written and the law as just, and which has its own tradition of deciding which version takes precedence when the two versions conflict. I had absorbed this understanding before I could articulate it, and I had carried it into the convent at 24, and it had shaped every significant decision I had made inside religious life, because religious life at its most honest is also about the distinction between the law as written and the law as just, and navigating that distinction with integrity is the central discipline of the vocation. Poland in November 1948 was 3 years into the communist consolidation of power that had been proceeding with increasing efficiency since the end of the war. The Soviet-backed government in Warsaw had been systematically eliminating political opposition, absorbing independent institutions, and conducting the particular kind of legal persecution that uses courts and charges and the formal apparatus of law to accomplish what earlier occupying powers had accomplished with more direct methods. The people being persecuted were not criminals in any meaningful sense. They were members of the wartime resistance who had fought the German occupation and who now refused to transfer their loyalty to the new authority that had replaced the German one. They were members of political parties that had existed before the war and were now being declared illegal. They were people who had said the wrong thing to the wrong person, or who had simply been sufficiently prominent in the pre-war world to constitute a symbolic problem for the new one. They were being arrested, tried in proceedings that had determined their verdicts before the evidence was heard, and sentenced to terms that were designed to remove them from public life permanently. Some of them were being killed. This was the world that Tomasz Wilecki had been running through for 3 days when he arrived at my gate. I treated the shoulder wound myself because the convent's connection to the nearest doctor was a relationship I was not prepared to involve in whatever this situation was until I understood the situation more fully. I had sufficient medical knowledge from 17 years of running the convent's small infirmary to manage a wound that was, on examination, more alarming in its blood loss than in its actual damage. The bullet had passed through the outer muscle of his shoulder without hitting bone or major vessel, and the primary danger was infection and blood loss rather than structural injury. I cleaned it and packed it and bound it, and I gave him broth, and I sat beside the infirmary bed and I listened to him talk for 2 hours while his body processed the warmth in the food and began the work of recovery. He told me who he was with the directness of a man who has calculated that directness is his best available option. His name was Tomasz Wilecki, and he had been a commander in the Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army, during the German occupation, operating in the Tatra region, which was why he knew these mountains and why he had run into them when he needed to disappear. After the war, he had attempted to transition into legal political activity, joining one of the remaining independent political groupings that were trying to operate within the new system while maintaining genuine independence from it. This had lasted until 1947, when the government had moved against that grouping comprehensively and arrest warrants had been issued for its senior members. He had been underground for a year, moving between safe houses, and the safe house he had been moving toward 3 days earlier had been compromised, and the people waiting for him had been replaced by security service agents, and the bullet in his shoulder was the result of his understanding that replacement approximately 2 seconds before the understanding would have come too late. I listened to all of this, and I asked him 3 questions. The first was whether anyone knew he had come to Nowy Targ specifically. He said no, that he had moved through the mountains without following any established route specifically to avoid leading anyone to a predictable location. The second question was whether he had any connection to anyone in Nowy Targ that the security services might know about. He said no, that he had chosen the Tatra region precisely because his wartime operations there had been conducted under a different identity and his connection to the area was not in any file that had survived the war. The third question was whether he was telling me the truth. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said that he was telling me everything that was true and omitting nothing that was relevant, and that he understood the difference between those 2 standards and was meeting the higher one. I believed him. Not because I was naive. I was 41 years old, and I had lived through a German occupation, and I was not a naive woman, but because the specificity of what he told me had the texture of truth rather than the texture of a prepared story, and because a man who has been running through the Tatra Mountains for 3 days with a bullet wound does not typically have the resources to construct a sophisticated deception. I made my decision that night, and I have examined it across the 60 years since with the thoroughness that a decision of that consequence deserves, and I have found it sound each time. I decided to keep him. I decided this for reasons that were practical and reasons that were moral and reasons that were the particular mountain people calculus I described earlier. The understanding that when the law as written and the law as just diverge sufficiently, the obligation is to the just version and the written version can wait. He was not a criminal. He was a man whose primary activity had been fighting the German occupation of Poland, an activity that the same government now persecuting him had officially celebrated until it became politically inconvenient. The charge against him was existing as the kind of person the current power found threatening, which is not a charge that deserves the cooperation of anyone with a functioning conscience. The practical arrangements required modification of the convent's existing spaces in ways that I managed over the following 2 weeks by framing them as storage reorganization, which was true in the sense that I was reorganizing what was stored where and for what purpose. The convent had a wine cellar beneath the main building, accessed through the kitchen, which had not been used for wine since the 1920s, and which had accumulated the particular mixture of legitimate stored goods and general institutional clutter that old cellars accumulate across decades of use. I cleared a section of it that was behind a section of shelving that, once the shelving was moved and a small partition constructed of the old timber that had been stored there for years, became a room of approximately 10 square meters that was not visible from the cellar entrance and that had its own ventilation through a gap in the foundation stone that I had always known about and never previously considered as anything other than a draft problem. Tomasz Wilecki lived in that room for 11 months. I was the only person in the convent who knew he was there, which I recognize required me to maintain a deception with the sisters I lived with, and which I include in my accounting of the costs of what I did because deception of people you love is a cost even when it is necessary, and I will not diminish it by omitting it. I brought him food from the kitchen in quantities that I adjusted to be unnoticeable against the normal variation in a communal kitchen's consumption. I brought him books, which he read with the focused intensity of a man who has nothing to do but think, and has decided to ensure that the thinking is as well informed as possible. I brought him news, the careful filtered news I gathered from the diocesan correspondence, and the conversations I had with the various clergy and officials who passed through the convent. and he listened to my reports with the analytical attention of a man who was not simply surviving but was continuing to understand the situation he was surviving within. We talked for hours through those 11 months. I want to be precise about the nature of those conversations because they have been described in various accounts, some accurate and some not, and the inaccurate descriptions tend to either romanticize them or diminish them, and neither does justice to what they actually were. They were the conversations of two intelligent people with complementary knowledge and divergent experience, engaged in the serious work of understanding a complex political situation from inside it. He knew the political and organizational dimensions of what was happening in Poland in ways that I did not, from the inside of the resistance movement and the attempts at post-war political organization. I knew the social and communal dimensions, the texture of how ordinary people were experiencing the consolidation of power, what they were saying and not saying, and what the gap between those two things meant. Together we built an understanding of the situation that neither of us could have built alone, and that understanding shaped the thinking that Tomasz Wilecki carried out of that cellar when he finally left and into the decades of political work that followed. He left in October 1949, 11 months after he had arrived. The security situation had shifted sufficiently that a route west through Czechoslovakia had become viable, arranged through a network that I had made contact with through the diocesan correspondence channels in ways that I will not detail because the people involved in those channels are not mine to expose even now. He left on a Tuesday morning before dawn, the same hour he had arrived, and I gave him a coat that had belonged to a deceased priest whose effects had been left to the convent and which fit him adequately, and bread and dried meat for the journey, and I opened the gate and he walked through it and I closed it and went back inside and went to morning prayers. He reached the West. He lived in emigration through the 1950s and the 1960s, building the networks and the reputation and the political relationships that the changing situation in Poland would eventually make relevant. The changes came slowly and then quickly in the way that changes in closed systems always come, and when they came, Tomasz Wilecki came back, and the work he had been building across decades became the work that the moment required. He held significant office. He shaped policy in the early years of Poland's return to genuine self-governance. Whether he deserves the description that his supporters gave him, whether president is the right word for what he eventually became, is something I have left to the historians and to the Polish people who lived through the period he helped shape. What I know is what I saw in the infirmary on a November night in 1948, a 26-year-old man with a bullet in his shoulder who told me he was a patriot and not a criminal and asked me to understand the difference. I understood it then. 60 years of living with that understanding has not altered it. Some distinctions are worth the cost of maintaining them. This one was.